People are talking about lack of ship ownership. People are talking about not understanding what a career at sea means. And from that data-driven approach, I was able to say, okay, so what's really going on here is something about globalization, something about maritime culture, and then I was able to consult the theory. So I think there was a question earlier about grounded theory. And I think one way you approach grounded theory is when you know, or you have very little assumptions about what it is that how your data is going to fit into a theoretical framework. So in the case with the seafarers, I knew very little about any theory that was going to make my research make sense. And the theory only emerged at the end. And it was something about globalization, about training, about development, and so on. If you don't go in blind and you have done reading already, so with the example of the histopathologists who are highly skilled medical specialists, I did a lot of reading around push-pull theory and what attracts people to the private sector from the public sector. So there, I went in with a sort of preformed idea of what codes to look for moments in the data where people talk about why they're leaving the public sector, why they, the conditions in the public sector, and so on. So there are two approaches that you can use to this initial coding process. But basically, you're a detective, and you're looking for sort of patterns, right, that make sense. Now, the biggest mistake I've seen is around this interview schedule, where researchers often think the codes are your actual interview questions. So when you apply for ethical clearance, you have to do sort of interview schedule guide with your 5 or 6 questions, and those are not your codes. Those are your prompt questions, your interview guides. So you could have a question that asks, X, but it doesn't make X your code. Your code is generated from the data that's generated from the interview, right? So what you need to do is you need to code for as many potential themes or patterns as possible at that point, even if you think it's not relevant to your study. You may find it useful later, or it may lead to another study, for example. So in the study I did on the histopathologists, I was really only interested in why they leave the public sector to the private sector. But something that kept appearing was this, they all were obsessed about talking about chemical pathologists, who I wasn't really even studying chemical pathologists. So I sort of bracketed that and I left it aside. And I later went on and I did some work on chemical pathologists. So you may find, so it leads you into different directions. So try and code for everything, even things that you think are not directly related to your study at that point. With the sailors, I was only interested in HR issues, right? But again, all my participants kept on speaking about the issue of race and nationality and ethnicity, and how there are no African seafarers from the continent because Africans make really bad seafarers. Or Filipinos make really great seafarers because, well, they live on an island. And so you may get that kind of data that's really rich, because now I had to say, okay, maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe HR managers are making decisions not just based on wage costs, but based on their stereotypes or perceptions of how they see different nationalities. So can you see that you have to be able to code everything, not just the items you think you're interested in? Code with context. So when you're coding, what you're really doing is you isolating an extract from your interview transcript, for example. But you need to have that extract within a context, because the context determines everything. So that extract was said in a certain context, and that might be reflected in the text above that quote or below that quote. It also helps you later in trying to analyze that, that quote in context. Don't ignore, so you've done 12 interviews, and of those 12 interviews, only one of your participants has said something different about an issue. Don't ignore it. Code it as a minority viewpoint, or, and you can come back to it. It might actually be important. Now, because we're human beings, our lives are contradictory, our actions are contradictory. When we talk, we can be very contradictory in the things we say. Don't try and smooth over the contradictions. Contradictions are a finding, right? I love my job, I hate my job. It's a finding. You know, I love being a seafarer, but I love working on shore-based jobs as well. That's a finding. That's the nature of qualitative research. So this is an example from the one study where I was trying to extract codes from the interview data. So participant one said, and I think one of the biggest challenges is the remuneration, because the public sector cannot compete with the private sector. Pay is lower, and they are struggling to retain people in the public sector, and so on. So just my first sense of this was that, okay, this is about pay differentials between the public and the private sector. That's the surface meaning, right? The obvious meaning. But there's something deeper here, which is not being said verbatim, but based on the context that I know and the context within these quotes in which these interviews were done, there's something about the tension between the public and private sector that's been said here. So when you are coding for semantics and you're coding for latent codes. Semantics mean you're coding for the things that people have actually said, the verbatim quotes. Let the interviewees speak for themselves. But when you're revisiting those interviews, you're thinking, okay, no one has directly said, I'm unhappy in my public sector job. But you can read into that, can't you? That there is something being said here. Now, another good example of semantic and latent, if you were doing something on in sort of cultural studies, and I don't know how many of you saw Miley Cyrus's performance at, was it the Grammys? VMA. Yeah, VMA. And so the semantic analysis of that was, oh, Miley Cyrus is trying to change her image, and you know, she's doing all this twerking, and it's this and that, and you know, I won't use some of the words that have been used to describe her, and so on. But so what? That's a journalist report. But let's look at let's analyze that as a theme in a latent way. And some of that conversation is happening now. No one has said anything about Robin Thicke, right? As a male who's much older than Miley Cyrus, you know, married and what that means, and engaging in this performance. And so the latent analysis there could be something around gender and power relations. Also, it's about cultural appropriation, because what Miley Cyrus has done with twerking is saying, oh, look at me, this is a new thing. But she's a white American girl using a form of dance that has historically sort of developed in the Caribbean and in Africa and so on. So now there's a whole debate about cultural appropriation, about gender, and so on, which is not a semantic analysis. We didn't see those debates happening in front of us. So you need to engage in both those kinds of coding, semantic and latent. It's very subjective, I know, but there's a whole literature on gender and power relations, for example. And in this example, there's a whole literature on public versus private sectors internationally and so on. So please make sure that you don't just do semantic levels of coding, because that's very journalistic-y. At the same time, you don't want to speak for your participants. If you are doing theory-driven coding, so with the public-private sector example, I went in with a theory around push-pull factors, and I was attempting to explain histopathologist sector switching using push-pull theory. So there, I try to code around the theory. I use the theory to assist me. So one of the things that the theory says is that remuneration is a pull factor, right? So can you see here, I coded for remuneration, and it sort of fitted into the sort of larger push-pull theory around remuneration and so on. And then you contextualize that within the literature and so on. So I think initially, if you sort of do that type of coding, whether you already informed by a theory or you're looking for a theory, it should be fine. I already spoke about data-driven coding. If very little has been published or is known about a specific empirical topic, in this case, the seafarers, then you're going to let your data decide your theory. So in this case, I mean, I went in with ideas of HRD and HRM, which is not really a theory, but it's, you know, I was only interested in HR issues. But the data took me in a completely different direction around issues of identity and how that influences employment practices. So your data can also determine where you end up. So you've familiarized yourself with your data, you've immersed yourself in it, you've done your initial coding. Now you are looking for the themes. Now, in a lot of the qualitative research, you'll see this sort of sentence: the themes have emerged. And I've also written that. The following themes have emerged. But we need to be, I think, more active now, right? And use words like discover, because it's an active process. The themes haven't emerged from nothing. So I think in terms of the language you use is don't use passive language. Write in an active way. I discovered the following themes. You discovered it, right? It didn't like miraculously appear. So here you're moving the codes from very specific extracts to broader themes. So those 4 extracts on pay differentials now become coded into a theme. Maybe we call that theme remuneration. You may have sub-themes. So maybe there are 3 different ways that people speak about remuneration. So your main theme is remuneration, and then you have sub-themes around remuneration. If you're using software like in Vivo or Atlas, the same principle applies. The software does not do your coding for you. It's an interpretive act. What it can do is look for how many times a certain word appears. How many times does the word unemployment appears? But in terms of the context in which the word unemployment appears, that's really left up to you. Look, the software is really progressing, and it can do a lot of things, but you still need to immerse yourself in the data. And it's a good idea at this point to represent your codes visually and how you think they're going to develop into themes visually. And this is a very iterative process, right? It's back and forth, back and forth. It's intuitive. I think there was a question on, well, can I trust the data, etc. I think we're more interested in meaning rather than truth, right? So what is the meaning that this data is generating? You know, and then you can get into debates about what is truth. One way to do this, and I'll discuss this in more detail, is the use of multiple coders. I have done this in 2 instances. In the one instance, you can hire an assistant, right? All that assistant does, and it has to be someone who's knowledgeable, is serves as, they call it also like inter-rater reliability. Both of you independently code, both of you independently come up with the themes, and you compare. That person doesn't necessarily have to share authorship with you, but you have to declare that to the journal. Some journals require just an acknowledgement of what that person did, and that's fine. Some journals require co-authorship. So there's no hard and fast rule. I think as a PhD scholar, you're an independent scholar. It's okay to use, I don't think your supervisor can assist, but I wouldn't really want to read 120 interviews. You know, yeah. So I think we can talk more about that. But one way to ensure, because it's such a subjective process, right, is you have to have multiple coders. 2 is fine. You and someone else is fine. You know, reviewing themes. So what you've established now are not your final themes, but let's call them your candidate themes. You're proposing these things as your final themes. So the point here is not to have 50 million themes, but you want to try and reduce further. So step 4 is you review these initial themes that you think are going to assist you, and maybe you want to collapse some themes together and make them one theme. Maybe some themes can be broken up into separate themes. But basically, you're looking for 2 things. You're looking for internal coherence in themes, and you're looking for differences amongst different themes. The rule of thumb here is if someone says, describe to me what your theme remuneration means, I should be able to do it in 2 sentences or 3 sentences at most. If I'm struggling to explain what the theme remuneration means, then maybe I need to revisit that definition. When people are writing up, I mean, I've seen examples of this, and I think it's a good idea. You may want to define your themes in your methodology section. So I discovered the following themes in my data set 1. The first theme was X. By X, I mean this. By Y, I mean this. By Z, I mean this. So the parameters of the theme are quite clear. And I think that deals with some of the issues around credibility as well. So themes should be different if they are different. And if they're the same, they need to be coherent and speak about the same thing. So coming back to this, you can see that what he's done here is in the 3rd column, he's listed the themes, right? So you may find a table like this quite useful, but I would suggest for a thesis, you need to go a step further and actually define the parameters of those themes. This was another study that John Ashmore did on public and private medical specialists in Cape Town. And here, okay, category is sort of interchangeable for theme in some of the literature. He's got his themes as rewards, physical environment, social environment, work itself. And he's got public satisfiers and private satisfiers. So you see that for him, these themes are very specifically defined. And when you define your themes very specifically, you can do so much more with the data. You can represent it visually like this, and you can, this is controversial, but you can even adopt more quantitative approaches, sort of counting how many times a certain instance of a theme appears amongst which participants and so on. So if you get the theme generating correct, it can make the representation of your data quite interesting. Here's an example of further reducing the themes in a table. Here the journal, for whatever reason, insisted that I do percentages, even though the number was so small. So, you just listen and you do it. But the point here is really to show you that once you've done that, there are lots of ways to present your data. So you've done your coding, you've revisited your themes, you've got your sort of candidate potential themes. Now you need to have your final themes. Now, life is short. You can't spend forever generating themes. So don't demand too much from a theme, right? So the theme remuneration can only mean one thing. Decide what it means. And you want to really have a manageable amount of themes. Here you can now put aside those themes that you feel don't matter for your project. You can revisit it for future work or so on, right? Writing the analysis. This is perhaps the most difficult part to explain. The best way to learn to write qualitative analysis is to read it. And unfortunately, most of the national journals in the management sciences are quantitative. If I look at my own discipline, like in HRM, for example. So look at the international literature, especially, and look for qualitative studies. And that's how you learn to write in an academic way, qualitative studies in an academic way, right? But these are sort of some common errors that I think that occur. Do not summarize each interview and think that's your analysis. So you've done the interview's 12, the transcript's 12 pages, you've summarized it into 2 paragraphs. That's not the correct way. You're not a journalist, so do not report facts only. Mr. So-and-so said he started work as a seafarer in 1962. He then did this, he then did that. You know, what's interesting about that? Also, avoid he said, she said stories. So person X said this, but person Y said that. Person X then said this, right? That's like a gossip column. So those are the common pitfalls. However, I mean, when I write, I do that. That's the first thing I do, right? Is I sort of do a sort of he said, she said thing, but it's like building a house. So then you revisit it and say, okay, what's interesting here? And then it really changes in the subsequent drafts. So you need to provide an analytic narrative. So writing for a journal, writing for a thesis, I think it's more or less the same. Try and avoid the word findings, results. For qualitative research, you're reporting findings, right? Most journals, also check the sort of journal. Some journals are very anti-qualitative. So, you know, do you really want to target that journal? So use the word findings rather. And so the big question that students have is, so with quantitative research, you know, I know my chapters. I have chapters on my independent variables. I have literature chapter on my dependent variable. How do I organize the dissertation for a qualitative project? Again, it varies, but one way you may want to do it is to organize it around your themes. Do you have a separate results chapter? I don't think so. You can have a findings chapter and then a discussion chapter, or you can integrate it, right? I'll leave that to you and your supervisor. But the form is far more flexible in a qualitative thesis than it is in a pure quantitative thesis. So under your findings, if you go in this route, you need to present, remember your findings, and I'm just going to stick with interview data, are actual extracts that demonstrate your themes. So you may say something like this. 5 themes were identified from my interviews. The first theme was remuneration. The following participants indicated, and then you quote. So that's more descriptive rather than analytical. You're giving the exact extracts that have made you code that theme for remuneration. So if there's 6 themes, you do that for each theme. Because we have to see the evidence, and because it's so subjective, of why and how you used those extracts to code for remuneration, for example, or whatever the theme is. So if you're going to separate your findings from your discussion, that's the way to do it. In your discussion section, that is where you will then do the sort of more analytical work. So this is an example of writing your findings. It's not an analysis. So a common thread through the various narratives of the participants was their implicit and explicit references to career pathing and career mobility. And so the theme here was career pathing. Histopathologists have better career pathing in the private sector. And I've sort of given evidence here of why I coded that as career pathing. These are only 2 quotes, but the actual section, has more. So you need to do this. There were 5 themes here, and so this is not really analytical, right? This is the extract. 5 of the participants said this, and that's why I've got that theme. So writing up your findings is more descriptive. Now, so this was writing up the findings of the theme of career pathing. But how do you do the analysis then? So here, you are taking the theme of career pathing, you're relating it to the literature. What does the literature say about career pathing in the medical profession? What does it say about career pathing amongst other highly skilled professionals? Is there a theory of career pathing that fits or doesn't fit etc. So here you can see participants' accounts also revealed a concern with career pathing, blah, blah, blah. Alsop et al. Emphasized that the decision, so it's relating it to the literature. In no way is this paragraph simply summarizing what was in the interview. Also, I would say, how is your interview